Hello and thanks for tuning in. Less than 2 months ago, the Assad government in Syria was overthrown by a militant grouping calling itself HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as Daesh, formerly known as ISIS, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front. Since then, they have been massacring thousands of unarmed civilians right across Syria, particularly from the Allawite and the Christian communities. Although and despite the fact that there are thousands of videos online showing these ongoing massacres, Western media has largely ignored what's going on and in some cases have acted as apologists for HTS. In the last week, the EU Commission has issued a statement essentially blaming the victims of the massacres as the perpetrators. I'm joined today by Vanessa Beeley, an independent journalist who until the HTS takeover was based in Damascus in Syria. She had to flee Damascus, escaping from the HTS head choppers by the skin of her teeth, and she's now based in Lebanon. She's been kind enough to join us today to try to let the people of Ireland and around the world know what is really happening in Syria, and is what's happening in Syria supported by our governments. Thanks for joining us today, Vanessa.
Oh, you're welcome, Finbar. It's good to be on with you.
It is. Unfortunately, there's nothing ever good coming from Syria over the last 11 to 12 years because of the international communities, the Western communities' resolve and determination to take Syria over and to turn it into a killing ground to distract from what they're doing in the Mideast. Just because most of our viewers won't really have an idea about what this is all about, Vanessa, can we briefly go back to how we came to this point? Up until 2011, Syria was an independent country. It wasn't at war. It had a government. It was considered almost to be like a European Mediterranean country in terms of the freedoms that women had, the secular nature of the government. Who and what has done what has been done to Syria?
Well, I mean, basically, I'm not going to go into great detail. I have written about it, but I mean, this kind of MI6, CIA, Mossad interference goes back to 1946, when Syria freed itself from the French mandate and became effectively, as you said, an independent sovereign country. And then for the next 75 years, there were various attempts by the Western alliance, the US and the UK, to uncouple Syria from its alliances, particularly then with the Soviet Union, which was a long-standing alliance, which of course was anathema to the rising neo-colonialist complex in the West. And sort of fast forward to 2011, a regime change war began, which had been planned way back from the year 2000 going forward to the new Middle East conference in 2003. Roland Dumas in 2013, the former French foreign minister, admitted that British officials had come to him in 2009 to tell him that they were planning an armed insurgence in Syria to basically topple the Syrian government. And, you know, if people are wondering why, like, why would Syria suddenly come under attack? It was simply because President Assad, Bashar al-Assad, the son of the previous president, Hafiz al-Assad, who also confounded Western alliances, attempts to overthrow his government and to impose a Muslim Brotherhood Takfiri regime in Syria. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is a construct invented by the British in Egypt in the late 20s, as is, of course, Zionism itself was incubated initially by the British before it was adopted by the United States. And effectively, I guess the 2 points, one is that President Assad refused to abandon the resistance axis. So he refused to abandon the Palestinians. He refused to kick Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance, which actually formed also out of the Palestinian refugees that fled Palestine in 1948 after the Nakba, the catastrophe, which was the initial Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So basically he refused to abandon his allies, and that included Russia again. Previously, of course, it was the Soviet Union, then it was Russia under Bashar al-Assad. And finally, he basically turned down the Qatari-Turkish pipeline project in favor of the Russian-Iranian pipeline project. And at that point in 2009 is when, as I said, the British started with the US to basically put into motion the plans to overthrow the Assad government and end his leadership of what was, as you said, an independent sovereign nation that had independent banking. It wasn't in hock to Goldman Sachs or to the IMF, unlike almost any other country now in West Asia or the Middle East, as people know it.
And it's not a case that the military invaded themselves. They did what they seem to have a standard in doing now, which was engaging the most extreme elements in the region and arming them and funding them and directing them and giving them the necessary intel to be able to create chaos. Well, initially it was in Western Iraq and they moved into Syria. And when we use the phrase head chopper, we're referring to those people who make videos where they cut off innocent civilians' heads because they're just innocent civilians because they're not armed on their side. The most extreme of the extreme. And so this HTS, which was Daesh, which was ISIS, which was al-Nusra Front, Assad's government, with the help of the Russians, have been battling them in Syria and trying to stop them, it's particularly around the Aleppo area, for quite a few years now. And we're successful in holding them back. This HTS, the first reference that I can find to them is around 2016-17. How did they develop? And how is it that the Assad government and the Syrian People's Army were not able to stop their latest onslaught?
That's $1 million question. There might be some answers in there that people are going to be surprised about. I mean, for people to understand, I was not only in Damascus, but I actually went to Hama and Homs, that were the cities that fell before Damascus fell during the final battles. And just to quickly explain who Hayat Tahrir al-Sham HTS is and who Abu Muhammad al-Julani is, who's now known as Ahmed Shara, which is a name that I refuse to adopt because he's a terrorist. He hasn't changed his terrorist activities or his ideology. Neither has a single member of his so-called government and military, all of whom were former leaders in HTS, which can be also called Al-Qaeda, because that's what Nusra Front was. And they didn't change their ideology. Nothing changed. If you look at his record of dominance in Idlib, which is the northwesterly region of Syria that Julani has been, if you like, in control of for some time, probably since 2016-17, it is, or was, as Brett McGurk described it, the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. And they were under the control of Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who, as you correctly said, was initially ISIS. Then he switched to Nusra Front al-Qaeda in Syria. And from here on in, I'm just going to call them al-Qaeda because it's easier than switching from all the various rebrandings that were designed to confuse people in the West and sort of lead them to thinking that HTS was some kind of moderate version of Al-Qaeda. And if you look at his record in Idlib, he took under the umbrella of Al-Qaeda various other extremist, fanatical factions that had carried out atrocities against the Syrian civilians throughout Syria prior to being basically evacuated into Idlib, where they all gathered and continued to be trained and supplied and armed by the West and by Turkey, and in the last 12 months by Ukraine, who was actually inside Idlib with special forces training Julani's militants, giving them drone technology, enabling them to develop their own drone technology, and also recruiting militants from within Julani's army to go to Ukraine and fight against Russia. So since, I think it was 2020 that Russia and Turkey brokered the ceasefire in Idlib, they have effectively been arming themselves, training themselves, equipping themselves with the help of the Western Alliance and Turkey and Israel. Israel has provided weapons and hospital treatment and air support for the terrorist groups since 2011. That's all very well documented. And so therefore, when the first attack happened in Aleppo, we had some warning, I think around 2 months before the attack took place. I was certainly told by a number of kind of military people that I was in touch with from the areas south of Idlib and south of Aleppo that they were expecting this attack. Now, when the attack took place, a number of things happened. First of all, the Russians withdrew completely and abandoned the Syrian Arab Army in Aleppo. The brigades of the Syrian Arab Army, very much against what many people are saying about the Syrian army, that it surrendered. And in fact, Putin's statement after the fall of Damascus claimed that the Syrian Arab Army had surrendered, and that is why Russia withdrew. This is not true. The Syrian Arab Army, under the command of a number of generals, withdrew from Aleppo, which was a strategic move, to northern Hama and south of Aleppo, where they regrouped, and they were actually winning against HTS. They were stopping the advance and they were pushing them back. At that point, and that's where the betrayal from within Syria comes in, but also sadly, I think the betrayal from Russia, and we'll talk about this. There was a removal of at least 15 of the generals that were then in command of the counterattacks, and they were imprisoned. And this was carried out by the Syrian chief of staff, General Abdul Karim, who's now in Russia living in luxury. And at that point, the command of the army was given to a commander, Suhail Hassan, who for years had been basically pretty much in the pay of the Russians, not in the pay of the Syrian state. And at that point, the army withdrew to an area called Ithria, which was further south. And from then on in, we started to see the surrender. Now, what I was told by members of the army and members of the command since then, because the generals that were in prison did manage to escape, thank God. Most of them were put into Hama prison. And by the time they were in prison, they were in civilian clothes. So actually, when HTS advanced, or Al-Qaeda advanced, and you will remember they opened all of the prisons, these generals actually managed to get out and nobody spotted them because they were wearing civilian clothes. So they managed to escape to various areas. Actually, for most of them, I know they're safe, but I don't actually know where they are for their own security sake. And at that point, the order came to not all the army, it came to various brigades. So what was happening is one brigade would surrender, the other brigade would keep fighting, and then suddenly they would realize they're completely surrounded because their comrades had surrendered, right? So it was complete disarray. They'd lost their command, communications had been cut, factions were surrendering and people were not aware of it. Even Hezbollah at this point, who had been about to come in to give reinforcement to the Syrian army, was told to withdraw because nobody understood what was going on. I mean, at that point in Damascus, we were receiving various messages. Nobody really had any idea of what was going on, but it was clear something had gone very wrong, and it was clear that there was a major betrayal. What I was also told that Israel was bombing Russia was bombing empty land, and that the convoys of HTS were given green light to advance. And if you imagine the countryside south of Aleppo is flat, it's a bit like Lincolnshire. It's completely flat. There's no, and it's one road. So how on earth could Russia, with its air power, not target the convoys and prevent their advance, right? And at this point, Russia actually returned to Haimamin, and the army was left alone, at which point, of course, there was this complete confusion and loss of morale, and many of them did abandon their weapons and try to leave because they understood that there had been a major betrayal. They were fighting without command, they were fighting without communications, and they were outnumbered. Plus, the drone warfare was causing massive casualty among the Syrian Arab army. And so at that point, and this was on Thursday, Friday, before the 8th of December. And on the Saturday, basically, I was told in the morning that an agreement had been reached that President Assad would step down, but not for 6 months, that there would be a coalition government formed that would represent all factions within the country, all minorities and so on in the country. And after 6 months, he would leave. And then in the afternoon, it became clear that the military advance was definitely heading towards Damascus, and it seemed that there was absolutely nothing to prevent that. And Russia at this point was completely, off the scene. There was no sign of them. We also found out later that Iran had tried to send reinforcements to the Khmeimim Russian base after promises made by Putin to President Assad that it would be allowed. And the reality was that Putin refused, and actually the plane that was incoming from Tehran was turned back by the United States and Iraq that threatened it with bringing it down if it didn't return immediately to Tehran. So Russia also prevented any Iranian reinforcements coming into the battle at that point, which was around the Thursday. On the Saturday night, basically I was still receiving messages at that point that everything was okay, we should just stay put, and the president was still in Damascus. That's proven to be incorrect. And I think at around 8 p.m. on the Saturday night, I started to receive messages that, like, no, this is like, we're really in trouble. Damascus has fallen. And at that point, the terrorists were surrounding the place where I lived. There was shooting in the air. Israel had started bombing using the bunker buster bombs to destroy Syrian military installations immediately, because at that point there was no air defense left to defend the country. Because the army had basically scattered. And so
but just Vanessa, your own position at that time in Damascus, you were reporting, you still didn't know what was going on yourself. So could you just give us an account of how you got the hell out of there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, the interesting thing, it wasn't actually Al-Qaeda or HTS that entered Damascus first. It was the, let's say, the armed groups that had previously been with Al-Qaeda in the south that entered Damascus. Now, what's kind of interesting is that those forces had been part of the amnesty and reconciliation brokered by Russia. And they'd been converted into what is known as the 5th Legion under the 8th Brigade, I think it was. But they were the first to actually enter Damascus. So they got there before Al-Qaeda. So that's kind of an interesting turnout as well, because in a sense, even though they had been rebranded by Russia, they probably still had contact with Israel. So it's kind of interesting, because if you imagine Al-Qaeda as being under, and the Syrian National Army, which was previously the Free Syrian Army, the Muslim Brotherhood factions that are under the control of Turkey, if they were trying to reach Damascus and then they were pipped to the post by potentially Israeli-linked groups, that gives an idea of what now is actually happening in Syria, whereas Turkey and Israel collaborated in the fall of the Syrian government. Now I do believe there is some conflict between Erdogan's neo-Ottoman ambitions and, of course, Israel's Greater Israel plans, both of them attempting to expand into Syrian territory, but that's something we can come on to. And then, sorry, you asked me how I got out. On the Sunday morning, basically, it was clear that Damascus had fallen. There was nobody on the border at that point. The Syrian security forces had all left, so nobody was quite sure, even if I wanted to get out, quite how I was going to do it, because there was no one to stamp passports or to give safe passage through the Syrian side of the border. And I had about an hour to pack a bag with 5 years worth of sort of collected life. And I had a very good driver, thank God, who, because they did actually try to break into my house at about 9 in the morning, assuming nobody was in there. And I was on the phone to a friend in Lebanon at the time who was telling me to go and find a kitchen knife. I wasn't quite sure what a kitchen knife was going to do up against an AK-47, but, you know, or whatever they were carrying.
But luckily I cut olives for them or something.
Yeah, and I'm not sure my aim's very good, and they were all quite blunt. But anyway, like basically the dogs barking. I mean, at that point I had 6 dogs in the house, and me yelling at them. They left. And then about an hour later, the driver came. I could only take 1 dog because I had no idea what was going on at the border, or if I'd be able to get through, or if I'd be able to get through the Lebanon border, or everything was closed. And I think the night before, Israel had been bombing the Lebanese border, and friends of mine that had escaped then had been caught up in the Israeli bombing. So we had no idea, basically. So I had to leave 5 of the dogs at home. The terrorists had already killed 2 of the cats. They shot them in the street. Basically, thank God I had a very brave driver who got me out of the area where I was living that was teeming with sort of various criminals and armed groups looting the houses there. And then the same thing at the border. Like they were so focused on looting that actually they didn't really notice us driving through. So that was the saving grace. And quite funny story that Al-Qaeda should be extreme Islam. I mean, it's not really even Islam, it's Wahhabi doctrine, who are totally against alcohol, were looting the duty-free shops at the Syrian border and stealing cases of whiskey and vodka and goodness knows what. So just to demonstrate their hypocrisy further. And so we managed to get through, thank God. In the end, it wasn't easy because there were a lot of them there. But as I said, they were so focused on looting that they weren't really looking at who was going through. The next day, people had a much harder time getting through because by then they'd sort of organized themselves a bit. And I know that other officials that were within the government escaped in the early hours of that morning, and their cars were shot at. One member of the government tried to make it to the coast. They stopped the car. They took the car, and he had to walk for 13 hours to get to the coast to the then relative safety of his family home. But it was chaos, actually.
It sounds like the narrative of a movie, except it's unfortunately all too real. In the last few weeks, and so from day one when HTS took over, there were videos of horrific crimes against humanity, horrific videos and images coming out, perpetrated by HTS, mainly against the Allawite and threatening the Christian communities. In the last 2 weeks, that seems to have ramped up. It's almost like there was a button pressed. There's a full-scale genocide happening. It would appear from what we're seeing of essentially the Allawite community mainly. A lot of Christian communities have fled from what I can see from reports. The Alawite community, just explained to people from a bit of reading that I've done, they are a part of the Shia sect. They would get on with the Irish because they're one of the only Islamic sects that actually allow the consumption of alcohol. So they might get on a little bit with the Irish, but they are being massacred at the moment. There was one video that came out which had no blood in it. It was some HTS members with an old man, and I think they were trying to kill him by exhaustion. So they were throwing him over their shoulders in wrestling moves. And this went on for quite a period of time until the man collapsed. I'm sure that poor man is dead by now. They have been shooting groups of unarmed civilians in the street. The videos are horrific and yet Western so-called media and Western political classes at times are even, in fact, trying to excuse and apologize for HTS in these instances, which are just, it's ongoing as we speak, Vanessa. From the reports that you're getting from people that you know inside Syria, first of all, can we validate that this is happening? And secondly, what kind of news are you getting out of there about these things?
I think it's important, first of all, just to put some context onto this. President Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafiz al-Assad, were Alawite. However, and so therefore the claim is that all Alawites were part of the dictatorship, so to speak. In reality, the Alawite communities are some of the poorest in Syria, and actually some of the most marginalized, because what the government tried to do was to not give them preferential treatment, which of course ended up having the opposite effect, that they were actually neglected to a large degree. But most of them they're very poor agricultural communities. And of course, you know, as you know, those that fight in any country are the poorest people. So, of course, the majority of those that fought against the Takfiri project, the Al-Qaeda project in Syria, and the army, were the Alawites and the Shia. But the majority of the army itself was Sunni Muslim. The majority of the government was Sunni Muslim. The president's wife was Sunni Muslim. The faith leaders were Sunni. Right? So just to put some context on this, because the Western narrative is always that the Alawites were genociding the Sunni Muslims in Syria, which is impossible, because the Alawites are about 2 to 3 million. They're about 10% of the population. It's impossible, right? So let's just squash that narrative, which has been the dominant narrative since 2011 from the BBC and CNN. And every single, intelligence-derived media outlet in the West. And so basically what has been going on since the 8th of December is this recrimination, these so-called revenge killings against the regime remnants. Again, this is, the narrative that the BBC definitely is disseminating. And I don't know if you remember the report by Jeremy Bowens very early on, where he's literally running enthusiastically alongside a lynch mob that are heading to find a so-called regime remnant in Damascus and to execute him. And the sheer joy with which Jeremy Bowen reports on this activity, no condemnation of extrajudicial murder without trial, without prosecution. So this demonstrates very clearly what the BBC represents and has always represented.
There's an irony in that, isn't there, that Jeremy Bowen was caught a few years ago in Ukraine, lying on the ground, pretending to be in a war zone,
with two ladies with shopping bags.
And two old ladies with shopping bags walk past him. So when there is no things going on, he's pretending there's massacres going on. And when massacres are really going on, he's pretending they're not happening. That's the BBC all over, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And so just to, again, a personal perspective on this, of course, I still have friends in the coastal area in Hama and Homs, because it's not only in the coastal area, it covers an entire area of kind of central Syria, south of Idlib and south of Aleppo. But really focused on the coastal areas where the majority of the Alawite communities are, both in the countryside and in the cities of Tartus and Latakia, Jable, and so on. But 2 days ago, I went to Akkad in northern Lebanon, because the Alawite people trying to escape slaughter, and they're not former army. Most of them are farmers, doctors, pharmacists, teachers, nothing to do with the former government. And even some of them were against the former government, to be honest. They campaigned against them. And they had the freedom of speech to do so under the Assad government. There was even I think he's No, he is Alawite, sorry. Alawite sheikh who was 90 years old from a town in Hama who was executed, and his son was executed along with him. Now, he was a complete humanitarian. He established, he put his own money into building a hospital, which welcomed all Syrians, including Sunni, Christian, Alawite, Shia, Ismaili, Yazidi, it didn't matter. Right? He totally was invested in the community, and they murdered him just because he's an Alawite.
There is a very strong sectarian element within this particular clique of head choppers, although they talk about associated with governments and so. Ultimately, this is downright raw sectarianism. I don't think these people are doing background checks on anybody that they're executing. They're just grabbing anybody from what we can see.
No, I mean anybody that moves, basically. You know, they're drunk on bloodlust, and when they're entering a village, if someone moves, they're shot, or they're killed, or they're tortured, or they're abused, or they're raped if they're a woman, or they're being trafficked. Young women are being trafficked from these villages to Idlib as brides for the other head choppers that are there. And also, you know, under Jolani, 40% of the militants under his command are foreign. That means Chechen Uyghurs from Xinjiang province in China, Turkmenistan, Afghanis, Uzbekistan, I mean, and Europeans, actually, because from, you know, 2013, 2014 onwards, ISIS members were coming in from Norway, from the Balkans, from Kosovo, from all over Europe, and also the UK. You know, British intelligence services were radicalizing youth and then transporting them into Syria for jihad, Germany, Sweden, and so on. Sorry, go on.
No, you're okay. So there's one thing topic that I really do want to touch upon, and one of the principal propagators of propaganda on behalf of these Islamic head choppers. I'm not going to give them any other names. They don't deserve. They keep on changing, but they're Islamic extremist head choppers. And one of the main propaganda organizations that are giving them support from Syria, and that have been nominated for, and I think got a Nobel Peace Prize, that have won Oscars award through films about them, and yet they are a cover for these Islamic head choppers, and that's the White Helmets, which originated from the workings of British intelligence officer James Le Mesurier. They're in high-pitched fever with the propaganda that they're putting out, and I would be very concerned that our viewers would watch stuff from the White Helmets and would actually believe it. So you, more than anybody else, you've spoken to UN consultative committees on the White Helmets specifically as a part of a wide research project that proved exactly what they are. Could you let our readers know, who are the White Helmets?
Yeah, I mean, actually in Ireland, you do have a fairly big complex promoting and supporting White Helmets since 2013, when they were actually established in Turkey and Jordan, and then embedded with predominantly Al-Qaeda, but also ISIS. In Syria, they were established by a former British military intelligence officer, James Le Mesurier, or Mesurier, however you pronounce that. Who previously worked in various NATO arenas of conflict, you know, but particularly in Kosovo in 1999 under the UN, under the control of Bernard Kouchner, where he was tasked as then he left the army, but I think he was probably still connected to military intelligence, but he was tasked with the transformation of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was made up of Al-Qaeda and Albanian warlords backed by the Brits and the US. And at that time, they were running cross-border operations, extracting organs from Serbian prisoners. And in what was known as the Yellow Houses, Carla Del Ponte, who was then with the UN, did a major investigation into this, despite a number of obstacles that were put in her way. And I recommend that everybody reads the book that I can't remember the name of, but if you just search Carla Del Ponte in Kosovo, you'll find it very easily. And he then, of course, basically used the blueprint of this transformation of the KLA into the Kosovo Security Corps to then, in Syria, to create this first responder group that would be embedded with the terrorist organizations and would provide them with a sort of humanitarian cover, and who would be tasked with corroborating. This is a 2017 UK Foreign Office document that actually states this, corroborating UK and US foreign policy and providing the evidence to the likes of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to corroborate foreign policy, which of course was known to be regime change. They were responsible for the staging of the chemical weapon attacks that have been discredited, most recently the one in Douma of 2018, in the eastern suburbs of Damascus. They've been discredited by the actual OPCW organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons inspectors who were on the ground. And I think one of them has just published a book called The Syria Scam, which again, I would recommend people read, because this is the on-the-ground testimony of the actual inspectors who completely deny the final report, which claims that chemical weapons were used by the Syrian government against their own civilians when they were actually on the point of liberating the whole of Eastern Ghouta. So logically, it doesn't even make sense, but it's been debunked. Every single White Helmet staged event in Syria, so from 2013, 2017, 2018, has been debunked. But they were also accused, and you mentioned a panel on the White Helmets at the UN in 2018, where basically the White Helmets were accused, based on the testimony of civilians in Syria, of carrying out organ trafficking operations and child trafficking operations. So likely injured children and adults were being ferried to Turkey, and their bodies were returned with the organs missing, very similar to, of course, what the Zionists do to Palestinians and have done historically. And what's happening right now is that when we look at what's going on with the ethnic cleansing, the Nakba, the Syrian Nakba, as I'm now calling it, because the Allawites are being ethnically cleansed, they're being displaced. 8,000 have arrived to date in northern Lebanon, 2,000 families, and that's increasing on an hourly basis. Thousands are coming into Lebanon to escape the slaughter in Syria. It's been reported both by Syrian civilians that I met with 2 days ago in northern Lebanon, but also by reports from on the ground in Syria that the White Helmets are again involved in organ extraction, that children in particular, because children's organs have an added value. I'm sorry to go into such dark depths on this, but organs, are one of the biggest harvests of war. If you look at what's been reported as going on in Ukraine, what went on in Kosovo, what goes on in every single Western engineered conflict, you will find what is known as the red market. And apparently there are actual doctors on the ground, there's refrigeration units, and as soon as someone is executed, they're on the ground to remove the organs. And yes, the White Helmets are involved in that. They're also involved in the disposal of the bodies of the executed civilians in order to avoid recrimination by the UN. Not that the UN is going to do anything, it's effectively providing cover for the Al-Qaeda operations, just as it has done since 2011, using the White Helmets to justify their findings, of course, because the White Helmets have been the witnesses in many of the trials of the Syrian government, trial by media, trial by UN, trial by government, but not by an actual legitimate court.
But they're not just a propaganda wing, are they? And they're not just organ harvesters. They are members of
they are Al-Qaeda
head chopping groups. They go to
absolutely.
the front lines, they prepare their battle lines, they participate in executions, they participate in torture, they participate actively as armed militants. The UN Consultative Committee on Terrorism, Online and Internet Terrorism, when they investigated it, they looked at 400 internet, social media accounts of members of the White Helmets, and on every one of them, they were promoting this extreme Islamic terrorism, promoting massacres, promoting sectarianism. So the idea that they're just a propaganda wing, I think it's essential that that is dispelled as well. They are proactive members of Islamic head-chopping militant groups that are massacring people based on the origins of their birth, essentially. So so I think it's important that the Irish people and anybody else watching this is fully aware that when they're seeing information from these Nobel awarded people, these Oscar-winning people, that they're being duped. I think it's essential that people understand that. In terms of where things are at right now, and is there even a glimmer of hope? I know that some of the Alawite communities tried to stand up to what was being done to them, and it seems to have actually worsened this situation. Assad is in Russia at the moment with his family. Yourself and not all the other good people have left the country or are living in fear in the country. Is there any hope that this is going to be resolved, and and then we have Israel taking and invading South Syria? Is there any hope that Syria, into the near or even far future, will be an independent, sovereign, secular state again?
It's very hard to maintain hope, to be honest. I mean, Israel was bombing Damascus this morning with, of course, the permission of Jolani, who does nothing to prevent Israeli expansionism since December the 8th, or even before. Israel was bombing Syria on a regular basis, and it was never condemned by HTS when it was confined to Idlib. And in fact, during the attacks, they were messaging to Israel that they're prepared to open an Israeli embassy in Damascus. There's been Mossad operatives in Damascus. There's been Zionist journalists enjoying themselves in Damascus since Jolani took over. There are pockets of resistance. I wouldn't describe them as only Alawite. There are various groups that have formed, many of them from the Syrian Arab Army, that realized that they had been betrayed, and that rather than stand and fight, because they were fighting sort of insurmountable odds, left but formed groups, particularly on the border with Lebanon and on the coastal areas, and are now starting to hit back against Al-Qaeda. In the south, there is the Islamic resistance in Syria, which is similar to the Islamic resistance in Iraq, which was formed after October the 7th. And they have been conducting isolated attacks against the Zionists in southern Syrian territory. But at the moment, it's not a cohesive resistance. I do know that they've also said, this must be a Syrian resistance. We don't want any external assistance, like from Lebanon or from Iran. We want to keep this as purely Syrian to avoid the claims that this is, an Iranian proxy force, etc. And of course, what's been happening is that the popular resistance has been attacking Al-Qaeda military. But then what has the Al-Qaeda military been doing? What it always did from 2011 onwards, it's attacking civilians, innocent civilians, in recrimination. So it doesn't engage with the popular resistance military. It engages with unarmed civilians, defenseless civilians. And, just for people to have an idea of the atrocities that are being committed, first of all internet has been cut to most of these towns and villages. So there's no means of communicating what's happening. Phones have been taken from the families in these villages. Entire villages are being wiped out with absolutely no knowledge of what's going on. People are getting burned alive. Children, I was told on Tuesday, children were being lined up and asked who should be executed first. So they were forced to watch their own siblings and their own comrades shot in front of them. There's a video of a 13-year-old boy being executed. Children are being lined up on sofas and the sofas being set on fire. Young girls aged 14, 13 are being raped multiple times before being killed. Women are being trafficked to Idlib. The savagery And the sadism that is ongoing here can only be compared to the Zionists and the Palestinians, what the Zionists did, the sheer sadistic pleasure they took in killing and torturing and abusing Palestinians, not only since October the 7th, but for the last 75 years plus, right? And of course, what this is what I call it a Zionist Takfiri project, because effectively what the Takfiris do, and this was mentioned in various CIA documents in 1986, but then also in an email sent to Hillary Clinton in 2012, where basically it said, you know, any conflict between Shia and Sunni, or any sectarian conflict in Syria, if President Assad is toppled, is going to be to the benefit of Israel. And that's exactly what has happened. Yeah, because that's exactly what has happened. While Jolani and his thugs are massacring Allawites and Christians, and if the Sunni or the Christians are sheltering the Allawites, because the Christian church in Syria actually put out instructions to the clergy that they must shelter the Allawites as Syrians, they must take them in. And so they're being killed if they do so. A Sunni sheikh in Damascus who spoke out against the massacres was himself executed in front of his children, and then his son was executed. And I've heard that they came back later to kill his daughter as well.
The instinct is to call these people animals, but you don't find that
animals
behavior
are way better. I mean, they're monsters.
Yeah.
No, they're monsters.
They're the things of nightmares, and the unfortunate and the terrible thing is ultimately they're propped up and they're directed by us in the West, if we want to call it the West, the Euro-American centric political classes. Vanessa, I've taken up enough of your time for now. Where can people follow you? Because it's really important. You're one of the only voices out there, consistent voices out there, reporting on what's happening in Syria. Where can people find you to follow you?
They can follow me at my Substack, which is just Vanessa Beeley on Substack. Telegram, on X, YouTube, but those are the main ones.
Okay, so you're out there and you're available. Vanessa, I really want to thank you, first of all, for joining us today. I also want to compel you to please stay safe. You've been putting yourself in,
I'll do my best.
In risky places and risky zones for a long time, but we wouldn't know what's happening if it wasn't for the likes of yourself, you know. So, and just to make the point, you're very welcome in Ireland at any time. If it's a holiday or if it's an escape from these crazy nutcases, you're welcome over here. Thanks for joining us, Vanessa. We'll speak to you again soon.